Most people see a wedding and cry tears of joy, but I looked at my sister Layla standing at the altar of the First Baptist Church and I smelled a federal crime. She was surrounded by $10,000 of imported white lilies and wearing a custom lace gown that cost more than my father made in a year. The groom was a man my parents called a blessing from God, but I knew him for what he truly was: a financial predator. He does not break into your house with a gun. He gets invited to Sunday dinner. He prays with your grandmother. He drives a leased luxury car and wears a bespoke suit while he systematically drains your family legacy until there is nothing left but dust. As the organ music swelled and the congregation stood up to honor the couple, Layla turned to look at me. She was not smiling. Her eyes were wide with terror, and a single bead of sweat rolled down her neck despite the church air conditioning blasting at full power. Before I tell you how I turned this dream wedding into a crime scene investigation, please like this video and subscribe if you have ever had to be the villain in your family's story to save them from themselves. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. My name is Kanisha, and at 32 years old I make my living as a forensic accountant. I do not look at people and see hearts or souls. I see assets, liabilities, and net worth. While my family saw a fairy tale ending, I saw a balance sheet bleeding red ink. I sat in the front row of the sanctuary, smoothing the fabric of my cream silk suit. I took a sip of water and watched the spectacle unfold. My parents, Otis and Clara, were beaming in the pew next to me. My mother was wearing a designer hat that I knew she could not afford, and my father was puffing out his chest, proud to be marrying his youngest daughter off to a wealthy white investor named Connor. To everyone else, Connor looked like a dream. He stood at the altar in a white tuxedo, flashing a smile that was all teeth and charm. But I was not looking at his smile. I was looking at his hands. He was gripping the podium with white-knuckled intensity, a sign of a man who is terrified of losing control. The church was freezing, yet Layla looked like she was burning alive. She was 24, a sweet, soft-spoken kindergarten teacher who had always done exactly what she was told. She looked beautiful, but she did not look like a bride. She looked like a hostage. The air smelled of expensive perfume and impending disaster. I looked around at the guests. Hundreds of people from our community were envious of this lavish display of wealth. They saw success. I saw leverage. Every flower, every crystal on the chandelier, every bottle of vintage champagne waiting on ice in the reception hall was bought on credit that did not exist. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tracing the sharp edge of the hidden folder inside my purse. I knew exactly who Connor was. I knew his real name was not Connor. And I knew that if Layla said I do, we would lose the only thing our grandfather had left us: the ranch. I caught Connor's eye. He winked at me. It was the smug, arrogant wink of a man who thought he had already won. He had no idea that the woman sitting in the front row was not just a sister. I was the executioner of his little scheme. The pastor cleared his throat, and the sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings like a gavel striking a judge's bench. He began the traditional recitation, asking if anyone present knew of any just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I could hear the hum of the video cameras and the rustle of silk dresses as guests shifted in their seats. I watched Connor. He did not look at the congregation. He was staring at Layla with a look that might have passed for devotion to the untrained eye, but to me it looked like a threat. He squeezed her hand so hard I saw her knuckles turn white through the lace of her gloves. That was when Layla broke script. Instead of facing the pastor to begin her vows, she turned abruptly toward the front pew where I sat. A murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave. For a second, I thought she was going to run. But she did not run. She stepped down from the altar, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and reached for me. I stood up instinctively. She collapsed into my arms, burying her face in my shoulder. To the guests it looked like a touching moment of sisterly love, a bride overwhelmed by emotion, needing comfort from her big sister before taking the biggest step of her life. My mother actually let out a soft sob of approval and dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. But I felt the truth. Layla was trembling so violently her teeth were chattering against my collarbone, and then I felt it. Her hand slid from the stems of her bouquet to my palm. The transfer took less than 3 seconds, but in my mind it played out in agonizing slow motion. Her fingers were cold and clammy, and they moved with a desperation that terrified me. The object she pressed into my hand was small, sharp-edged, and damp with sweat. It was a scrap of paper torn from a hymnal hidden among the pristine white roses. I closed my fist around it, instantly shielding it from the cameras, and more importantly from Connor's predatory gaze. The contrast made my stomach turn. Connor stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, stiff and flawless like a plastic mannequin, while my sister was secretly passing me a piece of trash that held her life in the balance. As Layla pulled away, she looked me dead in the eye. Her mascara was smeared, but her gaze was terrified and pleading. She whispered one word so quietly only I could hear: "Please." She turned back to the altar, climbing the steps like a woman walking to the gallows. Connor smiled at her, but his eyes darted to my closed fist. He suspected something. I sat back down and kept my hands in my lap below the pew line where no one could see. I unfolded the scrap of paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was jagged, scrawled in a hurry with a shaky hand, likely written in the bathroom moments before walking down the aisle. It did not say he is cheating or I do not love him. It was far worse. It read, "He knows about the oil field. Save me." My heart stopped beating for a full second. This was not just about the house or the wedding or even my parents' debt. This was about the mineral rights underneath our grandfather's worthless dirt land in Texas. Connor was not just a fraud. He was a corporate spy who had found out about the geological survey before we did. And I had about 10 seconds to stop this wedding before he legally owned half of $1 billion secret. I did not scream because screaming is for people who have lost control, and I was the only person in that building who had any idea what was actually happening. I simply stood up. The movement was sharp and deliberate, like a soldier snapping to attention. I stepped out of the pew and into the center aisle. Click, clack, click, clack. My stiletto heels struck the polished heart pine floor with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock counting down to an explosion. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling, cutting through the silence of the sanctuary. The pastor stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. My mother Clara gasped audibly from the front row and hissed my name in a tone that usually made people freeze, but I did not turn around. I kept my eyes locked on the altar. Connor watched me approach. His perfect smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, revealing the predator beneath the mask. He shifted his weight, blocking Layla from my view with his body. He leaned in close to her, his hand gripping her bicep. From the pews, it looked like a loving groom steadying his nervous bride, but I was now standing at the base of the stairs, close enough to see the truth. His fingertips were turning white from the pressure. He was digging his nails into her soft skin, trying to use pain to keep her silent and compliant. That physical aggression was the final confirmation I needed. He was not just a con artist, he was a monster. I walked straight up the 3 marble steps to the altar. The pastor looked at me with confusion, expecting perhaps an unplanned reading or a poem. Instead, I reached out and took the microphone directly from his hand. The feedback whine pierced the air, making several guests cover their ears. Connor lunged forward, his voice a low, venomous whisper that only I could hear. "Sit down, Kenesha. Do not do this. If you say one word, I will destroy your family. I will ruin your father." I ignored him completely. I turned my back to him, facing the 300 guests who were staring at me in stunned silence. I adjusted my silk jacket and spoke with the calm professional detachment I used when testifying in federal court. "I apologize for the interruption, everyone. However, we are experiencing a significant technical difficulty with the ceremony. It appears the groom has omitted a critical part of his background, specifically the active warrants for his arrest regarding real estate fraud and identity theft in 3 different states." The silence in the room shattered instantly. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the church, followed immediately by the roar of 300 people starting to whisper at once. Connor abandoned his facade. He grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around his face, twisted into a mask of pure rage. "You are crazy!" he shouted, his voice cracking as it boomed through the speakers I was still holding. "She is lying. She is jealous because she is 32 and alone. Get her out of here." But as he shouted, he made a critical error. In his panic to attack me, he had let go of Layla. And that was exactly what I wanted. The moment Connor released Layla, my parents filled the void. They did not run to the altar to check on their trembling youngest daughter, or to ask why she was shaking so violently she could barely stand. They ran to comfort the criminal. My father Otis scrambled up the marble steps, his face purple with a mixture of exertion and rage. He was not looking at the bruises forming on Layla's arm. He was looking at the shocked faces of the church elders and the wealthy business associates in the front row. He was terrified not for his child's safety, but for his own reputation. In his mind, he was not seeing a rescue. He was seeing the humiliation of a scandal that would be the talk of the country club for the next decade. He grabbed my arm with a grip that was intended to hurt. "Kanisha, have you lost your mind?" he hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "Sit down immediately before I drag you out of here myself. You are ruining everything we have worked for." I tried to pull away, but before I could respond, my mother made her move. Clara did not speak. She acted. She marched up the steps with the determination of a woman watching her social standing crumble before her eyes. She swung her hand in a wide arc. Her palm connected with my left cheek with a force that snapped my head back. Because I was still holding the microphone near my face, the sound of the slap boomed through the sanctuary speakers like a gunshot. The feedback squealed violently, causing half the congregation to cover their ears. The physical pain was sharp and hot, and I could taste the metallic tang of blood where my tooth had cut into my inner lip. But the emotional impact was far heavier. I slowly turned my head back to look at her. My mother stood there, chest heaving, her eyes filled with a hatred I had never seen directed at anyone but enemies. In that moment, I realized the depth of their delusion. They were not just protecting Connor, they were protecting their investment. They were protecting the luxury cars parked outside the vacations they had bragged about, and the image of a perfect, successful family they had sold to the community. To them, I was not a whistleblower. I was an arsonist burning down their dream house. "You ungrateful, jealous girl," my mother screamed, and this time she did not care who heard her. "Look at what you have done. You could never find a man like him, so you had to destroy your sister's happiness." The atmosphere in the church shifted instantly. I looked out at the sea of faces and I saw judgment. They did not know about the fraud or the threats or the stolen land. They only saw a bitter 32-year-old woman ruining a wedding and being disciplined by her distraught mother. The narrative had flipped just as Connor knew it would. He stood behind my parents, massaging his wrist, looking for all the world like the victim of a crazy sister-in-law. My father shoved me hard toward the stairs. "Get out," he spat. "You are no daughter of mine. Leave now, or I will have the ushers throw you out." I looked at Layla. She was sobbing silently, her head bowed, defeated by the combined weight of our parents' disapproval. She looked small and broken. I realized then that logic and facts would not work in this room. The blindness of the crowd was total because they wanted the fairy tale to be true more than they wanted to know the truth. I had to retreat, but only to reload. Connor did not lash out. He did not scream or try to wrestle the microphone back with force. He did something far more dangerous. He let his shoulders slump and covered his face with his hands. His body began to shake with what looked like uncontrollable grief. It was a masterclass in manipulation. He reached out and gently took the microphone from my hand as I stood frozen by my father's shove. When he looked up, his eyes were wet with fresh tears. He looked at the congregation, then at Layla, and finally at me, with an expression of profound betrayal. "I am so sorry everyone had to see this," he said, his voice cracking perfectly on the last word. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his eyes. I promised Layla I would never bring this up because family is important, but I cannot let Kanisha ruin our day with these lies. He took a deep breath, composing himself like a brave man facing a firing squad. The truth is, Kanisha came to my hotel room 3 months ago. She told me that Layla was too young for me. She told me that I needed a woman with experience. When I refused her advances and told her I loved her sister, she promised me I would regret it. The gasp that went through the church was louder than the organ music. It was a physical blow. I stood there stunned, not by the lie itself, but by the sheer audacity of it. He had taken my professional accusation of fraud and twisted it into a petty narrative of sexual jealousy. And it worked. I looked around the room and saw the shift immediately. The church elders who had looked confused were now looking at me with disgust. My cousins were whispering behind their hands. To them, the story made perfect sense. Connor was the golden ticket. He was handsome, wealthy, and white. Of course, the single 32-year-old sister would want him. Of course, she would be jealous. Connor continued his performance, walking over to wrap an arm around a sobbing Layla. "I forgive you, Kanisha," he said into the microphone, his voice thick with false benevolence. "I know you are hurting. I know you are lonely, but please let your sister be happy." The congregation murmured their approval. "Amen," said a deacon in the back. They saw a saint forgiving a sinner. But I was standing 5 feet away. I was the only one close enough to see his face clearly, while the rest of the room looked at his back or his profile. As he hugged Layla, pressing her face into his chest so she could not speak, he looked directly at me over her shoulder. The tears on his cheeks were real, but the look in his eyes was dead cold. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was a micro-expression of pure delight. He was mocking me. His eyes were dancing with the thrill of the con. He was telling me, without saying a word, that he could rewrite reality because he owned the audience. He had weaponized my own family against me and turned me into a pariah in less than 2 minutes. I realized then that I had brought a spreadsheet to a knife fight. Logic does not work on people who are desperate to believe in a fairy tale. I had to get out of there before I was physically removed, but I made sure to lock eyes with him one last time. I wanted him to know that he had won the battle, but he had just drafted a declaration of war. The double doors of the church burst open, and the humid heat of the Georgia afternoon hit us like a physical wall. It was a stark contrast to the air-conditioned sanctuary we had just left, but the temperature rising outside was nothing compared to the volatility unfolding on the pavement. Connor was no longer playing the part of the grieving, misunderstood groom. He was dragging Layla by her upper arm, moving with the urgency of a criminal fleeing a bank robbery. Layla was stumbling in her heavy gown, her heels scraping against the concrete as she tried to keep her balance. She looked back at me, her eyes wide and desperate, but she did not scream. She knew that screaming would only make his grip tighter. He shoved her into the back of the waiting stretch limousine with enough force that I saw her head snap back against the leather seat. I ran down the steps trying to reach the car door before he could close it. I needed to get her out of there. I needed to get her away from him. But I never made it to the curb. A heavy hand slammed into my chest, halting my momentum instantly. It was my father, Otis. He stood between me and the car, his chest heaving, his face twisted into a snarl that made him look like a stranger. He did not look like the man who had taught me how to ride a bike. He looked like a man protecting his ego at all costs. "You are done, Kanisha," he shouted, breathless with rage. "Do not take another step. You have embarrassed this family for the last time." I tried to step around him, but my mother Clara was there too. She did not shout. She simply extended her arms and shoved me. It was not a gentle push. It was a shove meant to hurt. I was off balance in my stilettos and I tumbled backward. My lower back hit the sharp edge of the concrete stairs and I landed hard on my elbows. The pain was sharp and immediate, radiating up my spine. I gasped for air, looking up at them from the ground. My mother looked down at me, her nose flared in disgust. "Do not follow us," she hissed. "You are dead to us. Do not call. Do not come to the house. You are a Cancer, Kanisha, and I am cutting you out." They turned their backs on me and climbed into the limousine. Connor slammed the door shut, but through the tinted window I could see his silhouette. He was not looking at his crying bride. He was looking at me. The engine roared to life and the long white car peeled away from the curb tires, screeching slightly, leaving the smell of burnt rubber hanging in the stagnant air. I sat there on the dirty church steps as the guests began to file out of the building. They walked around me, giving me a wide berth, whispering to each other and staring at the fallen woman who had tried to ruin a fairy tale. I did not cry. Crying is a waste of hydration, and I had work to do. I slowly pushed myself up. My cream silk suit was stained with dirt, and there was a scrape on my elbow that was beginning to bleed, but my mind was crystal clear. The fall had knocked the wind out of me, but it had also knocked the hesitation out of me. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now. I dialed a number I had saved for emergencies only. Marcus picked up on the first ring. He was a private investigator I had used for difficult audits in the past, a former detective who knew how to find things that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. "I need a full workup," I said, my voice flat and cold. "The name is Connor, usually goes by Kyle in Florida. Check real estate licenses in Texas and cross-reference with shell companies in the Caymans. I want his debts, I want his associates, and I want to know who holds the lien on his life." Marcus paused, then asked how deep I wanted him to dig. I watched the limousine disappear around the corner. "I want you to dig until you hit the bottom of hell, Marcus. He thinks he just won a victory because he has the girl and the parents. But he made a fatal mistake. He left the one person who knows how to count the money standing. He just won a battle, but he has unwittingly started a total war. To understand how a man like Connor could brainwash my entire family in less than 2 seasons, we have to rewind the clock 6 months. The devil does not usually enter through the front door, but Connor walked right up the steps of the New Hope Baptist Church on a Sunday morning like he owned the building. At the time, the church was facing a crisis that kept my father awake at night. The historic slate roof had been leaking for 3 years, and the fundraising committee was still $40,000 short of the repair costs. My father, Otis, was the head deacon, and he took every drop of rain that fell into the buckets in the sanctuary personally. He felt it was a reflection of his failure to lead. He had been praying for a miracle, but unfortunately what he got was a magician. Connor arrived in a matte black sports car that roared into the parking lot, disrupting the opening hymn. He did not look like anyone in our congregation. He was wearing a navy blue suit that fit too perfectly, and a watch that cost more than the pastor's Honda. He sat in the back pew, but he radiated an energy that demanded attention. He did not sing. He did not pray. He observed. He watched the room with the calculated focus of a wolf assessing a herd of sheep, looking for the ones that wanted to be led. When the pastor made the weekly plea for the building fund, most people looked down at their shoes or dug around for loose change. That was when Connor made his move. He stood up and walked down the center aisle. He did not wait for the collection plate. He walked straight to the pulpit. The entire room went silent. He apologized for the interruption with a voice that was smooth like velvet and announced that he had been moved by the spirit of the community. He said he was an angel investor looking to support traditional values. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He did not write a check, because checks leave a paper trail and take time to clear. He pulled out a brick of $100 bills, wrapped in a simple rubber band. $10,000 in cold, hard cash. He placed it on the altar like an offering to God, but I know now it was actually an investment in fraud. My mother Clara gasped so loud she nearly choked. My father looked at the money, and then at Connor with a reverence usually reserved for biblical prophets. In that moment, Connor bought their trust. He bypassed all the skepticism and background checks that a stranger should have faced because he solved their biggest problem in 10 seconds. He told them he had just closed a big deal in real estate and wanted to tithe. The truth was that money likely came from a high-stakes poker game or a previous victim he had just bled dry in Florida. But my parents were blinded by the shine. They did not see a con artist. They saw a wealthy white man, validating their church, and by extension, validating them. After the service, Connor did not leave. He shook my father's hand and told him he had great leadership energy. Then he looked up at the choir loft where my sister Layla was folding her sheet music. He asked who the angel with the soprano voice was. My father practically tripped over himself to introduce them. That $10,000 was not a donation. It was the entrance fee to ruin my sister's life. If the cash donation at church was the bait, then the dinner party at my parents' house 2 weeks later was the hook that snagged them for good. Connor did not just come for a meal. He came bearing gifts that were calculated to dismantle any remaining defenses my parents might have had. He walked into our modest living room carrying glossy orange bags that every woman recognizes instantly. He handed the largest one to my mother Clara with a shy, humble smile that did not reach his eyes. When she pulled out the black leather Hermes Birkin bag, she actually screamed. She held it to her chest like a newborn baby, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me with triumph in her eyes, as if to say, "Look what he thinks I am worth." I sat in the armchair sipping my iced tea and watching the performance with the cold detachment of an auditor. From 5 feet away, the bag looked magnificent. But I have spent years investigating counterfeit luxury goods rings in Miami. As my mother paraded around the room, I noticed the slight irregularity in the saddle stitching on the handle, and the fact that the gold hardware was a shade too yellow. It was a superfake, a high-end counterfeit, likely purchased for $300 in Chinatown, not $30,000 in Paris. But I said nothing. Breaking her heart in that moment would only make me the villain. Then Connor turned to my father. He presented Otis with a set of custom gold-plated golf clubs. My father does not even play golf, but he has always wanted to be the kind of man who belongs to a country club. Connor knew this. He had profiled them perfectly. "You deserve the best," Otis Connor said, clapping my father on the back. "A man of your stature should not be working so hard. You should be enjoying the fruits of your labor." My father stood taller, puffing out his chest, holding the 7-iron like it was a scepter. For the first time in his life, he felt seen by a white man of power, and that validation was more intoxicating than any alcohol. After dinner, as we sat in the living room, Connor made his pivot. He poured brandy for my father and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I want to take care of you both," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, intimate register. "You have raised an incredible daughter in Layla, and I want to repay that debt. I am looking for land. I want to build a retirement estate for you. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere private." My parents looked at each other with wide disbelief. They were already mentally decorating a mansion they did not own. That was when Connor stood up and walked over to the fireplace mantel. He picked up a framed black and white photograph that had been sitting there gathering dust for decades. It was a picture of our grandfather standing in front of a wooden fence on the Texas ranch property. Connor studied it with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "This has character," he said softly, tracing the frame with his thumb. "Where is this?" My father laughed dismissively. "Oh, that is just the old Legacy Hills place in West Texas," he said, waving his hand. "Just 500 acres of dirt and rattlesnakes. Nothing grows there. It is useless." I watched Connor's face in the reflection of the mirror above the mantel. For a split second, the mask slipped. His eyes did not see dirt and rattlesnakes. They lit up with the distinct hunger of a man who had just struck gold. He turned around slowly, schooling his features back into an expression of casual interest. "Dirt can be beautiful," he said smoothly. "Maybe I could take that burden off your hands. I could deal with the taxes and clean it up for you." My parents nodded eagerly, thinking they were getting rid of a liability. I gripped my glass tighter. I did not know yet what was under that dirt, but I knew that Connor had just found his target. 2 weeks after the gift exchange, Connor invited the entire family to dinner at the Capitol Grill in Buckhead. He ordered a bottle of Cabernet that cost $600 without even looking at the wine list. My father Otis was impressed by the price tag, but I was interested in the transaction mechanics. I watched Connor hand the waiter a heavy black metal credit card. To the untrained eye, it looked like an exclusive Centurion card, but I recognized the design immediately. It was a prepaid novelty card you can buy online to mimic the appearance of wealth without the actual credit limit. That was my signal to start the interrogation. While my mother Clara was gushing over the lobster bisque, I decided to switch into forensic mode. I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin and looked directly across the table. "So, Connor?" I said, keeping my voice conversational but my eyes locked on his pupils. "I did a little digging into that angel investment firm you mentioned at church. It is interesting because I could not find a single Securities and Exchange Commission filing under that name. Are you operating under a shell company? Or is your liquidity purely theoretical?" The table went dead silent. Layla stopped chewing her steak. Connor did not flinch. He swirled his wine and gave me a condescending smile, the kind a teacher gives a slow student. "Oh, Kanisha," he said, chuckling softly. "You are thinking in terms of traditional fiat currency and centralized banking. That is the old economy. I operate exclusively in decentralized finance and high-yield blockchain staking. My assets are liquid, but they are off the grid to maximize tax efficiency." It was a word salad of nonsensical buzzwords designed to confuse people who do not understand finance. To my parents, it sounded sophisticated and modern. To me, it sounded like a classic Ponzi scheme script. I put down my fork and leaned in. "Tax efficiency is one thing," I said, my voice hardening. "But hiding assets usually means you are either laundering money or you do not actually have any. Show me the audit trail, Connor. If you are legitimate, you have nothing to hide." My father slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the silverware and drawing looks from nearby tables. "That is enough, Kanisha," he barked. His face was red, and it was not just from the wine. "Why must you always be so difficult? This man is treating us to $1,000 meal, and you are treating him like a criminal in a police station." "I am treating him like a variable that does not balance," I replied calmly. My mother chimed in then, and her words cut deeper than my father's anger. She leaned across the table, her eyes narrowing with a mix of pity and disdain. "We know what this is really about, Kanisha. You are 32 years old and you come home to an empty apartment every night with your cats. It kills you to see your little sister happy with a successful man, does it not? You are so bitter that you have to invent problems just to bring everyone down to your level of misery. Stop being a jealous old maid and let your sister live." I looked at Layla, waiting for her to defend me. She just looked down at her plate, terrified of rocking the boat. Connor reached out and squeezed my mother's hand. "It is okay, Clara," he said with fake sympathy. "Strong, independent women like Kanisha often have trouble trusting men because they are used to being in control. I do not take it personally. He was gaslighting me in real time, and my parents were handing him the matches. I realized then that facts would not save them. They did not want the truth. They wanted the lobster and the lie." Legacy Hills was 500 acres of absolute desolation located in the armpit of West Texas. It was a landscape of red dirt, mesquite bushes, and a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The temperature was hovering near 100 degrees and the air tasted like dust and dried sage. My parents were sweating profusely in their linen clothes, fanning themselves with travel brochures, but their eyes were bright with delusion. They were not seeing the barren wasteland in front of them. They were seeing the mirage Connor was painting. He stood on a ridge pointing at a patch of cracked earth, describing a Tuscan villa with a wraparound porch and a shimmering infinity pool. My father Otis nodded along, mentally placing a barbecue grill on a patio that did not exist, while my mother Clara cooed about the potential sunset views. They were completely intoxicated by the fantasy. But I was not listening to the sales pitch, I was watching the salesman. For a man who claimed he wanted to build a family sanctuary, Connor seemed strangely uninterested in the actual topography of the building site. He kept checking his wristwatch, but he was not looking at the time. He was looking at the altimeter and GPS coordinates. When my parents walked ahead to inspect the old property line, Connor lingered behind. He told them he needed to check the cell service reception to ensure they would have good internet for their retirement. It was a lazy lie, but my parents bought it without hesitation. I did not. I pretended to follow my parents, but as soon as they turned the corner past a cluster of scrub oaks, I doubled back. I crouched behind a rusted water trough and watched him. Connor was not checking for signal bars. He had pulled a device from his pocket that I had never seen before. It looked like a heavy industrial smartphone, but it was thicker with a metallic probe extending from the bottom. He knelt down in the dirt, completely ignoring the expensive suit trousers he was ruining. He pressed the device against a protruding formation of gray rock. It emitted a low, rhythmic chirping sound like a Geiger counter. He studied the digital readout with the intense focus of a surgeon reading a heart monitor. This was not the behavior of a real estate investor or a son-in-law looking for a place to build a guest house. This was the behavior of a prospector surveying a claim. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy-duty plastic bag. He picked up a loose chunk of the jagged gray rock, dropped it into the bag, and sealed it tight. He took a marker and scribbled a sequence of numbers on the plastic. He looked around, furtively scanning the horizon like a coyote sensing a trap. I held my breath, pressing myself into the dirt. Real estate developers look at the view. They look at the grade of the land. They do not analyze the mineral composition of the soil. In that moment, the pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a terrifying snap. Connor did not care about the surface of the land. He was interested in what was buried underneath it. He was not looking for a home. He was looking for a resource to extract. The way he cradled that bag of dirt told me that the rock was worth more than my father's entire life savings, and Connor intended to steal it right out from under us. The isolation did not happen overnight. It was a slow, systematic siege of her autonomy that began the moment he started spending nights at her apartment. Layla used to love her independence. Her one-bedroom flat in Midtown was her sanctuary, filled with books and the smell of vanilla candles. But within a month of dating Connor, the atmosphere changed. It stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a surveillance state. He bought her a new phone as a gift, claiming her old one was too slow for the business apps he wanted her to use to help manage their future empire. Layla thought it was generous. I knew it was a digital leash. He installed a family safety app on her device, telling her he was worried about the rising crime rates in Atlanta. He said he needed to know she was safe at all times because he loved her too much to lose her. It sounded romantic to a girl who had never been prioritized before. In reality, he was tracking her location 24 hours a day. If she stopped at the grocery store for 15 minutes longer than usual, he would text her asking who she was talking to. If she went to lunch with her teacher friends, he would call during the meal just to mark his territory. He was suffocating her under the guise of protection. I tried to reach her during this time. I sent her text messages asking to meet for coffee, just the two of us. I sent her links to articles about investment fraud, hoping she would read between the lines. I never got a reply. For weeks I thought my sister was ignoring me. I thought she was angry that I had questioned his finances at dinner. I found out later that I was fighting a ghost. Connor knew her passcode. He would wait until she was in the shower or asleep, and he would scroll through her notifications with the cold efficiency of a censor. He deleted my messages before she ever saw them. He blocked my number during the day and unblocked it at night so she would never suspect a thing. To Layla, it looked like her big sister had abandoned her. To me, it looked like my little sister had chosen him over me. It was a perfect divide-and-conquer strategy. But the technology was only half the battle. The psychological warfare was far more damaging. Connor began to dismantle her confidence brick by brick. Layla was a brilliant educator who managed 20 kindergartners every day, but Connor made her feel like she was incapable of tying her own shoes. He would correct her grammar in front of waiters. He would sigh loudly when she misplaced her keys and say things like, "You are so scattered." "Layla, I honestly do not know how you would survive in the real world without me looking out for you. He convinced her that she was fragile. He convinced her that she was lucky he was willing to put up with her incompetence. By the time the engagement ring was on her finger, the vibrant, independent woman I knew was gone. In her place was a nervous shadow who looked at Connor for permission before she even ordered a glass of water. He had successfully cut the herd. He had separated the prey from the protector, and now there was no one left to whisper in her ear that the man she loved was actually a wolf. The final nail in the coffin was hammered in inside my father's home office, a small room filled with plaques from the church and photos of a life spent working middle management jobs. My father Otis was a proud man, but he was also a man who felt the clock ticking. He was 65 years old and his retirement fund was modest at best. He watched his friends buy boats and second homes while he worried about the rising cost of his blood pressure medication. Connor identified this insecurity with the precision of a sniper. He did not offer my father charity because that would have offended his pride. Instead, he offered him an exclusive opportunity to sit at the big table. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon while my mother was out grocery shopping. Connor came over with a stack of documents and a bottle of scotch. He told my father that his investment firm had an opening in a high-frequency trading algorithm that was usually reserved for institutional investors with a $10 million buy-in. But because Otis was family, Connor said he would pull some strings and let him in for a fraction of the cost. He promised a 20% return on investment, compounded monthly. Any first-year finance student knows that those numbers are impossible without high risk or fraud. But my father did not see a red flag. He saw a lifeline. He saw a way to finally become the wealthy patriarch he had always pretended to be. Otis drained his entire 401k. He liquidated his savings bonds. He even took out a second mortgage on the family home without telling my mother. He handed over nearly $300,000 to Connor, believing he was securing his legacy. For the first month, Connor actually paid him. He gave my father a check for $60,000, claiming it was the first month's profit. My father was ecstatic. He bought a new suit and felt like a genius. But that payment was just the bait to get him to swallow the hook. It is the classic mechanism of a Ponzi scheme, paying early investors with their own money to build blind trust. Then the trap snapped shut. 2 weeks before the wedding, Connor walked into that same office, but he did not bring scotch. He brought a digital tablet showing a catastrophic market crash. He told my father that the algorithm had failed due to unforeseen global volatility. The money was gone. All of it. But it was worse than just losing the principal. Connor explained that because the investment was leveraged, my father was now responsible for the margin call. He did not just have $0. He owed the firm an additional $200,000, and the debt was due immediately. My father collapsed into his chair, clutching his chest. He was looking at financial ruin at an age where he could never earn that money back. That was when Connor changed. The charming son-in-law vanished, and the predator emerged. He leaned over the desk and told my father that the people who ran the fund were dangerous. He said they would come for the house and they would come for Clara. But then he offered a solution. He said he would absorb the debt personally. He would pay off the $200,000 and keep my father out of jail. All Otis had to do was ensure that Layla walked down that aisle and that the rights to the Texas land were transferred to Connor's holding company. My father was not just a supporter of the wedding anymore. He was a hostage. He had to sell his daughter to save his life. The night before the wedding was not filled with champagne toasts or excited whispers between bridesmaids. It was the scene of a hostage negotiation that took place in the presidential suite of the Ritz-Carlton. Layla had finally gathered the courage to leave. She was frantically packing a suitcase, her hands shaking as she threw clothes into the bag when the keycard beeped and the door swung open. Connor did not look surprised to see her packing. He walked into the room with the casual arrogance of a man who held all the cards and locked the deadbolt behind him. He did not yell. He did not try to stop her physically. He simply tossed a thick manila envelope onto the bed on top of her silk pajamas. He sat down in the velvet armchair and poured himself a drink from the minibar. "Go ahead and leave, Layla," he said, taking a slow sip. "But before you walk out that door, you should take a look at what your father signed this afternoon." Layla froze. She reached for the envelope and pulled out the documents. They were loan agreements, promissory notes, and a confession of wire fraud, all bearing Otis's signature. Connor had structured the Ponzi scheme so that on paper it looked like my father was the architect of the fraud, not the victim. Connor leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Here is the situation. Your father currently owes my firm $200,000. He also inadvertently signed a document admitting to misappropriating funds from the other investors. If you leave this room, I make a phone call to the SEC and the FBI. Otis will be arrested before breakfast. He is 65 years old, Layla. He will die in federal prison." Layla dropped the papers to the floor, her face draining of color. She looked at him with pure horror, realizing for the first time that she was sleeping with a monster. "What do you want?" she whispered. Connor smiled. "I want exactly what we agreed on. You walk down that aisle, you say I do, and immediately after the reception, you sign the deed transfer for the Texas property over to my holding company. You do that, and the debt vanishes. Your father stays a free man. You refuse, and I burn your entire family to the ground by noon tomorrow." She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. She was trapped. She could not sacrifice her father to save herself. Connor stood up, walked over to her, and kissed her forehead with a chilling tenderness. "Get some sleep, my love," he said, stepping over her weeping form. "You have a big day tomorrow." That was the moment her spirit broke. That was the moment she realized the only way out was to scream for help without making a sound. The memory of that confession faded as reality snapped back into focus. I was no longer watching the past. I was sitting in my parents' living room, in the present day, staring at the wreckage of the aftermath. The air in the house was thick with tension and the smell of my mother's nervous sweat. The wedding was over. The guests had gone home. But the nightmare was just beginning. Connor was sitting on the sofa, holding a glass of my father's scotch, looking at us with cold, dead eyes. The flashback was over, but the war had just arrived at our doorstep. The air in my parents' living room was so thick with hostility, it felt less like a family home and more like a military tribunal where the verdict had already been decided. We had driven back from the church in separate cars, but the silence in the house was collective and suffocating. My mother Clara was the first to break it. She ripped the expensive designer hat from her head and threw it onto the coffee table with enough force to knock over a porcelain figurine. She began to pace back and forth on the Persian rug, her heels sinking into the fabric like claws. She was not crying for her daughter's pain. She was weeping for her social standing. "Look at my phone, Kenesha!" my mother screamed, holding up her device, which was lighting up incessantly with notifications. "Everyone is texting me. The deacons, the choir director, even your Aunt Sarah, who never talks to us. They all want to know why my oldest daughter is mentally unstable. Do you have any idea how much humiliation you have caused us today? We will never be able to show our faces at the country club again." She collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands, sobbing about how I had destroyed the most important day of her life. It was telling that she considered Layla's wedding to be her day, not her daughter's. My father Otis stood by the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a glass of scotch, with a hand that shook noticeably. He downed the amber liquid in one gulp and turned to face me, his eyes bloodshot and hard. "You are a saboteur," he spat the word out like a curse. "You could not stand to see us succeed. You could not stand to see your sister marry a man who could actually do something for this family. You have always thought you were better than us with your degrees and your city apartment. Well, congratulations, Kenesha. You finally proved it. You think you are better than everyone, including the man who put a roof over your head." I stood by the fireplace, my arms crossed over my chest, refusing to let them see me bleed. I looked at Layla. She was sitting in the corner armchair, still wearing her wedding dress, which now looked like a costume from a tragedy. She was staring at the floor, hugging herself, rocking slightly back and forth. She did not say a word. She was terrified to speak because the jailer was sitting right next to her. Connor sat on the love seat. His tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened just enough to look weary but dignified. He was playing the role of the benevolent martyr to perfection. He sighed deeply and looked at my parents with soft, sorrowful eyes. "Please, Otis, Clara, do not be too hard on her," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "Kanisha is obviously going through something. I have read that women her age often experience severe emotional breaks when they feel life passing them by. I do not blame her for lashing out. I just pity her. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. By defending me, he made himself look like a saint and made me look like a hysterical, jealous spinster." My mother looked up at him with teary adoration. "You are too good for this family, Connor," she sniffled. "I am so sorry you have to deal with her madness." I stood there watching them comfort the shark while the water filled with blood, realizing that in this courtroom I was never going to be the witness. I was the accused, and the judge and jury had been bought and paid for long ago. The emotional manipulation was only the opening act. Once Connor had secured my parents' sympathy, he moved swiftly to the business end of his scheme. He reached down to the floor and lifted his leather briefcase onto the coffee table. The sound of the brass latches clicking open echoed in the silent room like the cocking of a gun. He did not rush. He moved with the calculated gravity of a doctor preparing to deliver a terminal diagnosis. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound with a heavy metal clip and slid them across the mahogany surface toward my father. The top page was terrifying by design. It featured a bold red stamp that read, "Notice of Seizure," in aggressive capital letters. Below that was the official-looking seal of the Texas Department of Revenue. Connor pointed to the document with a manicured finger. "I did not want to burden you with this before the wedding, Otis, because I wanted you to enjoy your day. But we ran a title search on the Legacy Hills property last week. It turns out your father did not just leave you land. He left you a catastrophe. According to these records, the property has accrued 50 years of unpaid property taxes and penalties. The state of Texas is initiating eminent domain proceedings to seize the land by Friday." My father picked up the paper, his hands trembling so badly the pages rattled. He stared at the numbers without comprehending them. 50 years, he whispered. "How is that possible? Dad always said the land was free and clear." Connor shook his head slowly, looking pained. "The elderly often get confused, Otis. He likely ignored the notices for decades. The total liability is nearly $400,000. If the state seizes it, they will also come after your personal assets to cover the difference. They will take this house. They will garnish your pension. You will be destitute within a month." My mother let out a strangled cry and clutched her chest. The fear in the room was palpable. They were watching their entire existence crumble because of a grandfather's supposed negligence. It was a lie, of course. I knew for a fact that agricultural land in that part of Texas had distinct tax exemptions, and my grandfather was meticulous with his records. But my parents did not know property law. They only knew fear. Connor waited for the panic to peak before offering the antidote. "However," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "there is a loophole. My legal team found a way to shield you. If you transfer the deed to my holding company immediately, I can categorize the property as a corporate distressed asset. That allows me to restructure the debt and negotiate with the state. I can pay off the back taxes using my company's credit line and save your reputation. You will lose the land, obviously, but you will keep your home and your pension. I am willing to take on this financial burden for you because we are family." He pushed a second document forward. It was a quitclaim deed already filled out and awaiting signatures. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his pocket and uncapped it, setting it beside the paper. It was a seamless performance. He had created a fake monster just so he could be the hero who slew it. I looked closely at the fake tax notice from my position by the fireplace. The font was slightly off standard government issuing, and the citation code referenced a statute that I knew applied to commercial zoning, not agricultural land. It was a forgery, but it was a high-quality one. Connor had printed these days ago. He had planned to trap them regardless of whether the wedding happened or not. He was not restructuring debt. He was stealing a diamond mine and convincing the victims to thank him for the robbery. The silence following Connor's ultimatum was heavy enough to crush bone. While my parents stared at the forged documents with the desperation of drowning swimmers reaching for a life raft, I turned my attention to the only person in the room who actually mattered. Layla was curled into the corner of the oversized beige armchair, looking small and shattered in her wedding dress. The white lace was wrinkled and stained with dirt from the church steps, a visual metaphor for the destruction of her innocence. She was hugging her knees to her chest, rocking slightly in a rhythm of self-soothing that I recognized from victims of severe trauma. I walked past the coffee table, ignoring my mother's hissed warning to stop making trouble. I knelt down in front of my sister so that I was eye level with her. Her makeup was ruined streaks of mascara staining her cheeks like war paint, but her eyes were dry now. They were empty. It was the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who has seen too much combat and has simply checked out of reality to survive. Layla. I said, my voice low and steady. Look at me. Do you believe this? Do you really believe that Granddaddy left us a tax debt? I reached out to take her hands. They were ice cold. She did not pull away, but she did not squeeze back either. She was a statue made of flesh and fear. Before she could answer, I felt the shift in the room's energy. Connor had not moved from the sofa. He had not spoken a word, he simply cleared his throat. It was a soft, innocuous sound, but to Layla it sounded like the racking of a shotgun slide. Her eyes darted to him instantly. He was watching her over the rim of his crystal glass, his expression completely blank, but his eyes were drilling a hole through her skull. It was a look of pure ownership. It was the way a master looks at a dog that is thinking about disobeying a command. He did not need to threaten her verbally because the threat had already been installed in her psyche months ago. Layla flinched physically. She turned back to me, and for a fleeting second I saw the plea for help resurface, but it was quickly drowned out by terror. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the silence. "Kanisha, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just sign the papers. I do not care about the land. I do not care about the money. I just want this to be over. Please just let us save Dad and move on. Do it for me." Her words were rehearsed. I could hear the cadence of Connor's voice underneath her tone. She was not asking me to save the land. She was begging me to stop the punishment. She believed that if she gave him what he wanted, the psychological torture would stop. She believed that if she surrendered, he would go back to being the charming man she fell in love with. My heart broke for her, but my resolve hardened into diamond. I realized then that I was not just fighting a con artist. I was fighting a hostage taker. And you do not negotiate with terrorists by giving them more ammunition. I stood up slowly, releasing her hands, knowing that to save her, I would have to lie to her face. I escaped to the kitchen ostensibly to get a glass of water, but really I needed to put a physical barrier between myself and the suffocating atmosphere of the living room. This kitchen used to be the heart of our home, filled with the smell of my mother's collard greens and the sound of laughter. Now it felt cold and sterile, like an operating theater where a lobotomy was about to take place. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard the door click shut behind me. It was my father, Otis. He did not look like the raging patriarch who had shoved me on the church steps an hour ago. He looked like a man whose soul had been scooped out, leaving only a shell of panic and regret. He walked over to where I stood, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw my father cry. It was not a dignified weeping. It was the messy, desperate sobbing of a man who sees the walls of a prison cell closing in around him. He reached out and grabbed my hands, not with aggression, but with the pathetic clinginess of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. Kanisha, please. He whispered, his voice thick with mucus and tears. You have to help me. It is not just the tax lien. I lied about the investment. I did not just lose my savings, I leveraged the account. When the market turned, I got hit with a margin call. I owe Connor's firm $200,000. I do not have it. I have nothing left. If we do not transfer that land to his holding company by tomorrow morning, they are going to audit my accounts. They will see everything. I will go to federal prison, Kanisha. I will die in a cage. I looked at this man who had raised me to be honest and hardworking, and I saw how fear had corroded his morality. Connor had played him perfectly. He had lured him in with greed and trapped him with shame. But the tragedy of the moment was not the debt itself. It was the transaction my father was begging for. He truly believed that Legacy Hills was worthless dirt. He thought he was trading a burden for his freedom. He had no idea that he was begging me to hand over a lottery ticket worth millions of dollars to the very man who had engineered his destruction. He tightened his grip on my hands, his eyes wild and pleading. It is just dirt, Kanisha, he rasped. It is 500 acres of dry, useless dust and rattlesnakes. Granddaddy left us nothing but a tax burden. Let Connor take it. Let him deal with the state. He is offering to wipe my debt clean if I just give him the deed. It is a miracle, Kanisha. Why can you not see that he is saving us? I pulled my hands away slowly, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. It was the ultimate con. Connor had convinced my father that the diamond in his pocket was a piece of glass and that he was doing him a favor by taking it off his hands. My father was not just a victim, he was an accomplice to his own robbery. I looked at his terrified face and realized that telling him the truth right now would kill him. If he knew he was sitting on a fortune, he would probably have a heart attack from the shock of how easily he had been duped. I had to save him, but I could not trust him. To save this family, I had to let him believe I was surrendering. I had to play the part of the obedient daughter one last time so that I could get close enough to Connor to cut his throat, legally speaking. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I watched my father wiping his nose with a cocktail napkin and my sister staring at nothing. I realized that if I kept fighting like a warrior, I would lose like a martyr. Direct confrontation had failed at the church, and it was failing in this living room because Connor held the ultimate leverage, which was my father's freedom. To disarm a bomb, you do not hit it with a hammer. You have to carefully unscrew the casing and cut the wires while your hands are shaking. It was time to stop being the aggressive sister and start being the defeated woman they all expected me to be. I let my shoulders slump. It was a physical surrender that signaled the end of hostilities. I uncrossed my arms and let them hang by my sides in a posture of exhaustion. I took a deep breath and let it out as a shuddering sigh. Then I lowered my head, avoiding Connor's eyes as if I were too ashamed to look at him. I walked over to the fireplace and picked up the fake tax documents, holding them like a death sentence. "You win, Connor," I said softly, my voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. I turned to face him, keeping my eyes downcast. "I am an accountant. I deal in realities, and the reality is that we are cornered. My father committed a crime, and you are offering a way out. I have been so focused on protecting the legacy that I forgot to protect the people." I looked at my parents. "Mom, Dad, I am sorry. I should not have caused a scene. I was just trying to be the hero, but I see now that I was just making things worse." My mother let out a sob of relief. "Oh, thank God, Kanisha," she cried. "Thank God you finally came to your senses." I turned back to Connor, who was watching me with the smug satisfaction of a cat that has finally tired out the mouse. "I will sign the papers," I said, forcing myself to look him in the eye with a feigned expression of humility. "I will transfer the deed. But I cannot sign this draft you brought. It is a standard quitclaim, and given the tax liens you mentioned, we need a warranty deed to ensure my father is fully indemnified against future prosecution. If we do this, we need to do it correctly so the IRS does not come back for him next year." Connor narrowed his eyes slightly, assessing the threat. I held my breath. This was the gamble. I was betting on his greed and his desire for absolute legal control. Give me 24 hours, I said. I will go to my office tonight. I will draft the warranty deed and the transfer documents myself. I will make sure everything is bulletproof. Tomorrow evening, bring Layla and my parents to my penthouse. We will have a notary there, and we will sign everything over to you. You get the land. Dad gets his freedom. And I will step out of your lives forever. Connor studied my face for a long time, searching for a crack in the facade. He saw a tired, broken woman who was trying to salvage her father's dignity with paperwork. He smiled, and it was the most chilling thing I had ever seen. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. That sounds reasonable, Kanisha, he said, walking over to pat my cheek. I knew you were a smart girl. I knew you would see the light eventually. He checked his watch. Tomorrow night at 7. Do not be late, and do not try anything clever. I have copies of your father's confession in 3 different safes. He gestured for Layla and my parents to follow him. We are leaving, he announced. Layla needs rest. I stood in the doorway and watched them go. My mother refused to look at me, but my father gave me a glance of pathetic gratitude. As the door clicked shut, the adrenaline that I had been suppressing flooded my system. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I had not surrendered. I had just bought myself one day. Connor thought he had broken me, but all he had done was give me 24 hours to sharpen the knife. I waited until 3 in the morning when the house had finally settled into the heavy silence of the dead of night. I took off my heels, leaving them by the back door, and moved through the hallway in my stocking feet. The floorboards of my childhood home were familiar terrain, and I knew exactly which steps to skip to avoid the creaks that would betray my presence. My parents were asleep in the master suite, likely sedated by emotional exhaustion and the false promise of salvation I had given them earlier. Connor was in the guest bedroom down the hall. I stood outside his door for a full minute listening. I could hear the deep rhythmic rasp of his snoring. It was the sound of a man who slept with the clear conscience of a sociopath, completely unbothered by the lives he was destroying. I pushed the door open inches at a time, my breath held tight in my chest. The room was illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Connor was sprawled out in the center of the queen bed, claiming the space with the same entitlement he used to claim our land. Layla was lying on the very edge of the mattress, her back pressed against the cold wall. She was not asleep. As I slipped into the room, her eyes opened immediately. She did not move a muscle and she did not make a sound, but she blinked twice rapidly. It was the signal we used to use as children when we were hiding from our parents during a game of hide and seek. It meant the coast is clear. I crept toward the mahogany dresser where Connor had carelessly dumped his belongings. His gold watch sat next to a thick roll of cash and his laptop. I did not need to guess his password. Earlier that evening, when I had hugged Layla goodbye, she had used a ballpoint pen to scribble a string of characters on the inside of my wrist. I glanced at the ink on my arm and typed it in. Alpha. $. King. 1995. Even his password was a testament to his arrogance. The screen flared to life, and I immediately dimmed the brightness to the lowest setting, praying the light would not disturb him. I inserted a military-grade flash drive loaded with forensic extraction software into the USB port. I did not waste time opening files or reading emails. I initiated a full mirror image of his hard drive. A gray progress bar appeared on the screen, moving with agonizing slowness. 20%, 30%. The fan on the laptop whirred to life, a soft hum that sounded like a jet engine in the silent room. Connor shifted in the bed. The springs groaned under his weight. He murmured something unintelligible and rolled over, flinging a heavy arm across Layla's waist. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. If he woke up now, there would be no explanation that could save me. I would be caught stealing from the man I had just promised to obey. Layla held her breath. She lay perfectly still, enduring his touch, forcing her body to remain limp so he would not wake fully. She was the anchor keeping him in the dream world, while I stole his reality. After 10 agonizing seconds, his breathing leveled out again, returning to the deep rhythm of sleep. 60%, 90%, complete. I pulled the drive from the port and slipped it inside my bra against my skin. I shut the laptop lid gently, ensuring the latch clicked silently. I looked at Layla one last time. Her eyes were wet with tears, but she gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. I could not take her with me yet. I had to leave her in the lion's den for 12 more hours to ensure the trap would spring correctly. I slipped out of the room and back into the hallway. As I walked out into the cool night air, I touched the drive against my chest. I finally had the gun. Now I just needed to go to my office and manufacture the bullets. I drove straight to my office in downtown Atlanta, the city lights blurring past my window like streaks of neon rain. My sanctuary is not a church or a home. It is a corner office on the 42nd floor surrounded by 3 monitors and a server secure enough to run a small country. I locked the door behind me and kicked off my shoes. The silence here was different from the silence at my parents' house. It was the silence of focus. It was the silence of a predator about to dissect its kill. I plugged the flash drive into my primary terminal and initiated the decryption sequence. Connor thought he was smart using standard encryption, but to a forensic accountant, that is like locking a bank vault with a zip tie. I poured a black coffee and watched the code cascade down the screen. Within 10 minutes, I was inside his digital life. The first thing I looked for was the money. He claimed to be a high-yield blockchain investor. I pulled up his primary operating accounts. The screen flashed a number that made me laugh out loud in the empty office. 0.00. The man who had donated $10,000 in cash to the church did not have a cent to his name in the banking system. He was living entirely on credit, kiting checks and moving debt between shell companies to create the illusion of liquidity. He was not an investor. He was a financial ghost. Then I opened the folder he had hidden deep within the system architecture labeled simply Old Tax Returns. I cross-referenced the Social Security number attached to the files with the National Criminal Database. The photo that popped up was not the polished groom in the white tuxedo. It was a mugshot from Tallahassee, Florida, dated 5 years ago. The man looking back at me with dead eyes and a bruise on his cheek was not named Connor. His name was Kyle. And according to the Florida Department of Corrections, Kyle was a career con artist who specialized in elder abuse and real estate fraud. He had served 18 months for tricking a widow out of her pension fund. He was not just a liar, he was a predator who had done this before. But the smoking gun was in the encrypted ledger I found buried in a subdirectory. It was a spreadsheet tracking his personal debts. The numbers were painted in blood red. It wasn't just credit card debt. It was private lending, hard money, the kind of money you borrow from people who do not sue you when you default. They break your legs. Kyle owed $5 million to a syndicate based in Macau. The due date was exactly 24 hours from now. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and felt the cold rush of adrenaline. The puzzle was complete. He did not want the Texas land to build a retirement home. He did not even want the lithium for himself. He needed an asset worth over $100 million to leverage against a $5 million death sentence. He was desperate. He was terrified. And he was completely broke. I looked at his mugshot on the screen and whispered to the empty room. Got you. I printed every single page. I now had the weapon. All I needed to do was aim it at his head and pull the trigger when the whole world was watching. I left the digital world behind and walked into the physical archive room at the back of my office suite. The air here was cool and smelled faintly of old paper and dust, which was a comforting scent compared to the stench of Connor's digital footprint. I needed to understand why a man who owed $5 million to a Macau gambling syndicate would risk his life for a patch of dirt in West Texas. Connor was a predator, but predators do not hunt without a scent. He knew something about that land that we did not, and I had a suspicion that the answer lay in the past. I pulled down a heavy cardboard box from the top shelf labeled Legacy Hills 1980. It contained the original survey documents and personal effects of my grandfather Silas. Silas was a man of few words who had bought those 500 acres when everyone else told him the soil was too alkaline for farming. My father always said Granddaddy was stubborn, but I knew he was intuitive. I opened the box and pushed aside yellowed tax receipts until my fingers brushed against worn leather. It was his field journal. Granddaddy used to walk the property line every morning writing down observations about the weather, the livestock, and the land itself. I opened the journal to the entries from late 1980, the year he stopped trying to grow cotton. The handwriting was jagged, but strong, written with a heavy hand. I scanned the pages looking for anything unusual. There were notes about drought and coyotes, but then I stopped at an entry dated October 14th. The ink was pressed deep into the paper, as if he had written it with excitement. I found the gray rocks again by the dry creek bed, he wrote. The cattle will not graze near them. I took a piece to the blacksmith in town. He hit it with a hammer and it sparked white hot. The old-timers call it the burning stone. It is no good for building fences, but I have a feeling it is special. I am going to leave that ridge alone. Maybe the girls will figure it out one day. I ran my finger over the words, burning stone. It was a colloquial term I had heard once in a geology elective back in college. In the 1980s in rural Texas, ranchers considered these rocks a nuisance because they were soft and reactive. But I knew the chemical name, spodumene. It is the hard rock source of lithium. In 1980, lithium was used for treating bipolar disorder and making industrial grease. It was a curiosity. But in today's economy, lithium is not a rock. It is white gold. It is the primary component of every electric vehicle battery, every smartphone, and every laptop on the planet. My grandfather had been sitting on one of the largest deposits of raw lithium in the state, and he had instinctively protected it, waiting for a future where its value would be recognized. He did not leave us a tax burden. He left us a battery that could power the world. Connor must have found a copy of an old geological survey, perhaps one that Granddaddy had commissioned, but never acted on. That was why Connor was so desperate. He was not stealing dirt. He was stealing the fuel of the 21st century. I closed the book and held it to my chest. Granddaddy Silas had been playing the long game from the grave, and now it was my turn to make sure his investment paid out to the right beneficiaries. I sat in front of the high-definition monitor in my office, the blue light casting long shadows across my desk. It was 5 in the morning, and the city outside was still asleep, but Dr. Aris Thorne was wide awake on the other end of the video call. Aris was the department head of geology at the State University, and a man who usually only got excited about tectonic plate shifts. Today, however, he looked like he had just seen a ghost. I had couriered the sample to his private lab 3 hours ago, a small plastic bag containing the dried red mud I had scraped from the treads of Connor's boots, which he had foolishly left by the back door of my parents' house. I needed independent verification to back up the stolen data, and Aris was the only one I trusted to be discreet. He did not say hello. He simply held up a spectrographic printout to the camera, his hand shaking slightly. "Where did you get this, Kenesha?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Please tell me you did not trespass on a government black site to get this." I told him it came from a family property in West Texas that we had always considered worthless. Aris laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. He leaned into the camera lens, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Kenesha, this is not worthless. This is not even soil. This is crushed spodumene ore mixed with high-grade clay." He pulled up a digital chart on the shared screen. The line on the graph spiked vertically in a way that defied normal geological surveys. He explained that normal soil has trace amounts of lithium, usually measured in parts per million. The sample I gave him was showing concentrations that were nearly pure. He told me that what my grandfather called the burning stone was actually one of the densest lithium deposits he had ever seen in North America. He took a deep breath and looked at me with deadly seriousness. "You are sitting on a strategic energy reserve. This is not about farming or ranching. This is the new oil. I stared at the graph, feeling the room spin. The numbers on the screen were not just data points, they were a death sentence for Connor's scheme. Aris continued speaking, his voice rising with academic fervor. With the current push for electric vehicles and renewable energy storage, this deposit is critical. If the vein runs as deep as this surface sample suggests, we are not talking about millions. We are talking about billions. This single plot of land could produce enough battery-grade lithium to power the entire United States automobile fleet for the next decade. The magnitude of the theft finally hit me. Connor was not just a con artist trying to pay off a gambling debt. He was attempting to steal a national resource. He was going to trade my father's freedom for a literal mountain of money and leave us with nothing. Aris asked me what I intended to do with this information. I looked at the red spike on the monitor, the scientific proof of my family's salvation and my enemy's destruction. I thanked Aris and ended the call. I did not just have a defense anymore. I had a nuclear option. Connor wanted to play games with fake debts and forged deeds, but he had forgotten the most important rule of business. Never try to rob someone who knows the true value of what they are holding. I closed my laptop and stood up. The sun was rising over Atlanta, and it was time to go to war. The red dry erase marker squeaked against the white porcelain board, a sound that usually annoyed me, but today sounded like the sharpening of a blade. The sun was fully up now, flooding my office with unforgiving morning light, but I was not looking at the view. I was looking at the math. In my line of work, numbers are the only language that cannot lie. People lie, contracts lie, but the bottom line always tells the truth. I drew a vertical line down the center of the board, dividing the universe into two distinct realities. On the left side, I wrote the word perception. On the right side, I wrote reality. Under perception, I wrote the figures that my father Otis believed were true. 500 acres of arid West Texas grazing land. In the current market, with no water rights and poor soil quality, that land was trading at roughly $400 an acre. I did the multiplication and wrote the total in black ink. $200,000. Below that, I wrote the debt my father thought he owed to Connor, plus the fraudulent tax lien Connor had fabricated. It came to roughly $400,000. In my father's mind, he was underwater. He was trading an asset worth $200,000 to wipe out a debt twice that size. To him, it looked like a mercy killing. He thought Connor was doing him a favor by taking the land. Then I moved to the right side of the board. I uncapped the green marker. This was the column that Connor knew about. This was the column that explained why a man would risk federal prison and impersonate a billionaire. I wrote down the data points from Dr. Thorne's report. Confirmed spodumene deposits. High-grade lithium concentration. Estimated extraction yield. I did not need to be a mining engineer to calculate the royalty valuation. Mining companies do not buy land for the dirt, they buy it for the rights to what is underneath. For a deposit of this magnitude, located on private land in the United States, with easy access to trucking routes, the signing bonus alone for the mineral lease would be 8 figures. I started writing zeros. A lot of them. Based on current commodity prices, the proven reserves on the Legacy Hills property were conservatively valued at $150 million over the life of the mine. I circled the number 3 times. 150 million. I stepped back and looked at the board. The contrast was nauseating. Connor was attempting to trade a fake debt of $200,000 for an asset worth $150 million. He was not just stealing a house or a car, he was stealing a dynasty. The sheer audacity of the margin took my breath away. It was a 75,000% return on investment. It was the kind of profit that toppled governments and started wars. If my father signed that deed tonight, he would not just be signing away land. He would be signing away the financial security of his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. He would be handing Connor the keys to the kingdom in exchange for a plastic trinket. I capped the marker with a loud snap. The math was done. The audit was complete. I knew the price of the prize and I knew the cost of the war. Now I just had to make sure that when the transaction happened tonight, Connor was the one who ended up in the red. I shifted my focus from the geological data to the communication logs on the mirrored drive, because I knew that in the world of high-stakes fraud, the numbers tell you what is missing, but the emails tell you who is coming to collect. I bypassed his standard inbox, which was filled with fake invoices and wedding planning threads, and went straight to a secure encrypted messaging app that he had failed to log out of. There was a thread at the top pinned with a red flag icon. The contact name was simply listed as the broker. I opened it, and the blood drained from my face. It was not a conversation with a bank or a hedge fund. It was a correspondence with a notorious offshore shell corporation known in intelligence circles for laundering money for Eastern European cartels. The document attached to the final email was a pre-sale agreement that stopped my heart. Connor had not just planned to steal the land, he had already sold it. 2 months ago, he had signed a contract, illegally pledging the mineral rights of Legacy Hills to this syndicate. The terms were terrifying. He had agreed to sell the entire $150 million asset for a fire sale price of $20 million in clean cash. It was a pennies-on-the-dollar deal that only a desperate junkie or a man with a gun to his head would sign. But the most damning detail was the transaction history. The syndicate had already wired him a non-refundable deposit of $2 million. I frantically checked his transaction logs again, searching for that $2 million. It was gone. He had burned through it in 6 weeks, paying off old gambling debts, leasing the sports cars, and funding the lavish charade of the wedding to impress my parents. He had spent the down payment on a house he did not own yet. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Connor was not waiting for a payday to get rich. He was waiting for the deed to save his life. The final email in the thread was dated yesterday morning, just hours before the wedding. It was short and devoid of professional pleasantries. It read simply, "The transfer window closes at midnight on Friday. If the deed is not in our possession by then, we will consider the contract in breach. We will require the immediate return of the deposit, plus the standard penalty fee. If funds are unavailable, we will proceed with physical liquidation of the guarantor." Physical liquidation. It was a polite corporate euphemism for murder. Connor was a dead man walking. He had taken $2 million from murderers, spent it all, and now had less than 24 hours to hand over my father's land, or he would be found floating in the Chattahoochee River. This explained everything. It explained the rush. It explained the sweating. It explained why he was willing to destroy a family to get a signature. He was not operating out of greed anymore. He was operating out of pure primal terror. He was a cornered rat, and I had just found the trapdoor. I printed the email and the contract. I finally understood the leverage. I did not need to threaten him with prison. I just needed to threaten him with failure. If I stopped him from getting that signature, I would not have to kill him. The mob would do it for me. I gathered the stack of incriminating evidence and locked it into my briefcase. It was time to head home and prepare for the final showdown. But as I walked to the parking garage, the air felt heavier than usual. I got into my sedan and pulled out onto the empty streets of Atlanta. The city was waking up, but the roads were still slick with morning dew. I checked my rearview mirror out of habit. A black SUV was following me. It was sitting 3 car lengths back, matching my speed perfectly. I changed lanes. It changed lanes. I took a random right turn down a narrow side street. The SUV followed its tires, squealing slightly as it accelerated to close the gap. My heart rate spiked, but my hands remained steady on the wheel. This was not a random tail. This was an escalation. I pressed the accelerator, pushing my engine to the limit. The SUV surged forward, its grille filling my rearview mirror like the mouth of a shark. They were not trying to be subtle anymore. They rammed my rear bumper. The impact jolted my neck and sent my car skidding toward the curb. I fought the steering wheel, correcting the slide, just in time to avoid a lamppost. I could see the silhouette of the driver behind me. He was wearing a mask. I slammed on the brakes hoping to force them to overshoot, but they were ready for it. The SUV swerved alongside me, boxing me in against a row of parked cars. I saw the passenger window of the black truck roll down. A hand extended holding a pistol equipped with a silencer. There was a dull pop like a champagne cork, and my passenger side window exploded inward. Diamonds of safety glass showered over the front seat, covering my briefcase and the leather upholstery in glittering shards. I ducked instinctively, swerving the car hard to the left, breaking the box and speeding down an alleyway. The SUV did not follow. They had delivered their message. I drove for another 2 miles, making erratic turns until I was certain I was clear. I pulled into a well-lit gas station parking lot and killed the engine. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting me all at once. I looked at the passenger seat. Lying amidst the broken glass was a small weighted envelope that had been thrown into the car the moment the window shattered. I reached over and picked it up. Inside was a single index card with 3 words scrawled in black marker: "Sign or die." I stared at the note and the jagged hole in my window where the wind was whistling through. A normal person would have driven straight to the police station. A normal person would have called her parents and begged for forgiveness just to make the violence stop. But I sat there in the cold morning light and I started to chuckle. The chuckle turned into a laugh, a dry, humorless sound that filled the small cabin. Connor had made a critical, tactical error. You do not send hitmen to break a window if you are confident in your victory. You do not resort to physical violence if your psychological manipulation is working. This was not a show of strength. It was a scream of panic. He was terrified. He knew that the clock was ticking down on his own life, and he was flailing. He was trying to scare me into submission because he had run out of clever lies. I tossed the note onto the dashboard. He thought he was the hunter, but by firing that shot, he had just confirmed that he was the prey. I was not going to sign. I was going to bury him. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, surrounded by the glittering debris of my shattered window. The smell of exhaust and fear hung heavy in the air, but my mind was operating with cold surgical precision. I needed to make the call now, while the physical evidence of his threat was still fresh. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I summoned every ounce of insecurity and weakness I had spent my life suppressing. I needed to become the victim he wanted me to be. I dialed his number with a trembling finger. He answered on the first ring as if he had been holding the phone waiting for my surrender. "Hello, Kanisha," his voice was smooth but tight. I could hear the background noise of a television, which meant he was back at my parents' house, playing the role of the relaxed house guest while his hitman did his dirty work. I let out a sob that was only half fake. "You win, Connor," I stammered, my voice pitching up into hysteria. "They shot out my window. There is glass everywhere. I could have been killed. Please, just tell them to stop. I cannot do this anymore. I am not a soldier. I am just an accountant." There was a pause on the other end. I could practically hear him smiling. "I do not know what you are talking about, Kanisha," he said, feigning ignorance, but his tone was mocking. "But I am glad you are finally realizing that stress is bad for your health. You need to focus on what is important: family and resolution." I took a shaky breath, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "I have the papers," I lied. "I am drafting the warranty deed right now. It is over. I just want my father to be safe. Bring everyone to my penthouse tonight at 7 o'clock. Bring Mom and Dad and Layla. We will sign everything in front of a notary, and you can take the title. Just please promise me no more black SUVs." Connor let out a low, satisfied hum. "That sounds like a wise decision, Kanisha. We will be there. 7 o'clock sharp. Do not make us wait. And Kanisha, do not try to be a hero again. It does not suit you." I hung up the phone and let it drop into my lap. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence of the morning. Slowly, the terrified expression on my face melted away like ice in the sun. It was replaced by a look of stone-cold determination. I reached into my glove box and pulled out a tissue to wipe the fake tears from my cheeks. He had bought the performance. He thought he had broken me with fear. He had no idea that he had just agreed to walk his entire criminal enterprise into a room that I controlled completely. I started the car and backed out of the parking space. He told me not to try to be a hero, and he was right. Heroes have rules. I was about to show him that I had none. I arrived at my building and took the service elevator to avoid questions about my shattered car window. When I walked into my penthouse, the atmosphere was not one of celebration. There were no hors d'oeuvres. There was no champagne on ice. Instead, the long mahogany dining table had been cleared of everything except 5 neat stacks of documents and a single black pen. Standing around the room were the people who were going to help me drive the final nail into Connor's coffin. David was leaning against the granite kitchen island checking his phone. We had gone to law school together before I pivoted to forensic accounting, and he went on to become one of the most feared assistant U.S. attorneys in the district. He was not here as a guest. He was here as the hammer. He looked up when I entered and gave me a grim nod. "The warrant is signed," he said, his voice low and professional. "We just need him to admit to the wire fraud on tape to make the charges stick for the grand jury. If he touches that pen intending to sign a fraudulent deed, he commits a federal felony in my jurisdiction." Sitting at the table were Marcus and Elena, 2 senior partners from the city's top corporate litigation firm. I had hired them at an hourly rate that made my stomach turn, but they were worth every penny. Their job was to ensure that the moment the criminal handcuffs went on, the civil asset protection protocols went into effect, immediately locking down the Texas land so Connor's creditors could not touch it. They looked like sharks circling a drop of blood, calm and ready to feed. I walked to the master bedroom door and cracked it open. Inside, 4 plainclothes officers from the Major Crimes Unit were checking their weapons and adjusting their tactical vests. They were the physical insurance policy. If Connor realized he was trapped and tried to fight his way out, these men would ensure he did not make it past the foyer. I closed the door and turned to the bookshelf in the living room. I adjusted the spine of a vintage encyclopedia, hiding the lens of a 4K micro camera. I checked the feed on my tablet. The angle was perfect, capturing the entire dining area in high definition. Every lie Connor told tonight, every threat he made, and every document he touched would be recorded in the cloud. The trap was set. The players were in position. I poured myself a glass of water, not because I was thirsty, but because my mouth was dry with anticipation. I checked my watch. 6:55. The elevator dinged down the hall. The sound echoed through the apartment like a starter pistol. I motioned for David and the lawyers to step into the kitchen out of the direct line of sight of the front door. I smoothed my skirt, took a deep breath, and composed my face into a mask of defeat. It was showtime. The chime of the private elevator was the only warning I got before the heavy steel doors slid open, revealing the cast of the tragedy. Connor stepped out first, crossing the threshold of my home, not like a guest, but like a conquering general entering a surrendered city. He had changed out of his tuxedo into a sharp charcoal suit with the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, displaying a gold chain. He radiated a sickening amount of energy, the kind of adrenaline high that comes from believing you have just pulled off the heist of the century. He looked around my foyer, taking in the high ceilings and the marble floors with a critical, appraising eye. "Nice place, Kenesha," he said with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "It is amazing what you can afford when you do not have a husband or children to distract you from your career." My parents followed him out of the elevator, but they did not share his swagger. They looked like prisoners of war marching toward a firing squad. My father, Otis, usually a man who filled a room with his presence, was hunched over, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He held his hat in his hands, wringing the brim as if he were trying to strangle it. He could not look at me. The shame radiating off him was palpable. He believed he was about to force his daughter to sign away her inheritance to cover his mistakes, and that guilt had aged him 10 years in a single day. My mother Clara walked beside him, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. She was pale and silent, her earlier fire completely extinguished by the cold reality of their financial ruin. Then came Layla. If my parents looked defeated, Layla looked destroyed. She stepped off the elevator last, moving with the stiff mechanical gait of a sleepwalker. She had changed into jeans and a sweater, but she was still wearing her bridal makeup, which was now smeared and dark around her eyes, giving her a skeletal appearance. She did not look at the apartment. She did not look at Connor. She looked straight through me, staring at a point on the far wall with dead, unseeing eyes. It was the look of a woman who had disassociated from her body to survive the trauma of the last 24 hours. Seeing her like that fueled a rage in my chest so hot it nearly burned through my composure, but I forced myself to swallow it down. I stepped forward, keeping my head lowered and my shoulders slumped in a posture of submission. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice quiet and trembling. "Please come in. I have everything set up in the dining room. I just want to get this over with so we can all move on." Connor walked past me, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "That is the spirit, Kanisha," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I knew you would come around. Sometimes we just need a little push to see what is really important." He walked toward the dining table, his eyes lighting up when he saw the stack of documents. He did not notice the closed kitchen door. He did not notice the camera hidden in the bookshelf. He only saw the paper and the pen. He thought he was walking toward his victory, but he was walking directly into his own grave. I ushered my family into the room and closed the heavy front door behind them, locking it with a loud, deliberate click. The play had begun, and there was no exit for the villain. Connor did not wait to be offered a drink. He walked straight to the vintage Globe bar in the corner of the living room, opening it with the familiarity of a man who had already mentally catalogued my assets. He pulled out a bottle of 25-year-old single malt scotch, a bottle I had been saving for a special occasion, and uncorked it without asking. The pop of the cork was loud in the silent room. He lined up 5 crystal tumblers and poured generous measures into each one, the amber liquid splashing against the glass. He was making himself at home in my sanctuary, desecrating the space with his arrogance. He picked up 2 glasses and walked over to the sofa where my parents sat huddled together. He forced a glass into my father's trembling hand, and then one into my mother's. They took them obediently, too terrified to refuse. Then he walked over to Layla, who was still standing by the window staring at the city skyline. He pressed a glass into her cold fingers and whispered something in her ear that made her flinch. Finally, he raised his own glass in a mock salute, turning to face the room with a wide, predatory smile. "To new beginnings," he announced, his voice booming with false conviviality. "I know the last 24 hours have been difficult. Change is always painful. But I want you all to know that I am doing this out of love. We are cutting out the rot so the family tree can grow stronger. By this time tomorrow, the debt will be gone, the stress will be a memory, and we will all be wealthy." He took a long, slow sip of the expensive scotch, savoring the taste of what he thought was total victory. My father took a sip just to hide his face behind the glass, but Layla set hers down on the windowsill untouched. Connor checked his watch. The casual demeanor evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, nervous energy. The deadline from the syndicate was ticking down in his head. "All right, let us get the boring administrative work out of the way," he said, setting his glass down on a coaster with a decisive clack. He rubbed his hands together and walked over to the dining table. "I have a courier waiting downstairs to run the deed to the filing office first thing in the morning. We need to get signatures on paper now." He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, uncapping his gold pen. He looked at me expectantly. "Give me the warranty deed, Kanisha. Let's finish this." I walked over to the sideboard and picked up the heavy legal binder I had prepared. It was 3 inches thick, bound in black leather. I carried it to the table with both hands, emphasizing its weight. I did not sit down. I stood at the opposite end of the table, facing him. I slid the binder across the polished mahogany surface. It glided smoothly and came to a stop right in front of him. "Here it is," I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. As requested, I have prepared a full warranty deed transferring all surface and mineral rights to your holding company. However, as a certified forensic accountant, I could not in good conscience let my father sign a transfer of this magnitude without attaching the full due diligence report. It includes the title history, the tax assessments, and the valuation metrics. It is just standard procedure, Connor. I am sure a businessman of your caliber understands the need for a paper trail. Connor laughed dismissively. You accountants always have to complicate things with extra paper, he said, shaking his head. He reached out and placed his hand on the binder. He was touching the evidence. He was putting his fingerprints on the gun that was about to kill him. He flipped the cover open, expecting to see a signature page. Instead, he saw the first document I had placed on top. It was not a deed. It was a printout of a geological survey with a bright red line spiking off the chart. His smile faltered. He blinked, looking closer at the page. The silence in the room shifted from fearful to electric. He was beginning to realize that the book he had just opened was not a surrender treaty. It was an indictment. Connor paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking over the geological survey I had placed on top. For a heartbeat, I thought he might actually read the data and realize that I knew about the lithium. The room went deathly still. I leaned in, resting my knuckles on the table, and spoke with a bored, bureaucratic tone. That is just the standard valuation metrics, Connor. To make the tax loss credible for the IRS, we have to disclose the mineral potential as speculative. It is just a formality to protect the write-off. He nodded quickly, his greed overriding his caution. The explanation made sense to him because he assumed I was trying to protect my father from an audit, not trying to entrap a criminal. He flipped the page, dismissing the warning sign with a wave of his hand. He was not interested in the geology. He was interested in the ownership. Underneath the survey lay the stack of legal documents I had prepared. I had placed small neon yellow sticky notes with an arrow and a bold X next to every signature line. It is a psychological trick used by car salesmen and mortgage brokers. When you direct the eye to the X, the brain stops reading the fine print and focuses solely on the mechanical act of signing. Connor fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. He uncapped his gold pen and pressed the nib to the paper. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was loud in the quiet room. Scritch, scratch, flip, scritch, scratch, flip. He was moving with manic speed. He did not read the paragraphs above the signature lines. He did not check the clauses. He just saw the X and signed his name. Kyle Connor. Kyle Connor. Kyle Connor. He was signing with a flourish, the loops of his letters large and arrogant. I watched his hand. It was a well-manicured hand, wearing a watch that cost more than my car, but it was shaking slightly. The tremor was not from excitement. It was from the adrenaline of a man who knows the clock is ticking. He was signing for his life. With every page he turned, he thought he was getting closer to the $20 million payout from the syndicate. He thought he was securing his freedom. He signed the quitclaim deed. Then he signed the transfer of assets. And then he reached the third document. This was the one David, my prosecutor friend, had drafted. The header was folded over so only the signature block was visible. If Connor had taken 2 seconds to lift the fold, he would have seen that he was signing a sworn affidavit, confirming that he had solicited funds from Otis based on a knowingly fraudulent investment vehicle. He was signing a confession to federal wire fraud. But Connor did not lift the fold. He was too close to the finish line. He saw the X, and he signed his name with force, punctuating the end of the signature with a sharp dot. He sat back in the chair, exhaling a long breath of triumph. He capped the pen and tossed it onto the table where it spun and clattered to a stop. He looked up at me, his eyes dancing with victory. Done, he said, spreading his hands wide. The land is mine. Your father is safe. And you, Kenesha, have just done the smartest thing of your life. He had no idea that the ink was not even dry on his own death warrant. Connor reached out to pull the heavy black binder toward him, his fingers twitching with the anticipation of ownership. He had signed the papers. He believed the transaction was complete. But before his hands could touch the leather cover, I placed my palm firmly on top of the document stack, pinning it to the table. He looked up at me with a flash of irritation. "We are done here, Kanisha," he said, his voice tight. "Give me the deed." I did not move my hand. "We are almost done," I corrected him. "But there is one final exhibit we need to review before the transfer is official. It is part of the due diligence I mentioned earlier." I picked up the silver remote control that had been sitting next to my water glass. Connor frowned, confused by the sudden change in protocol. I pointed the remote at the 85-inch ultra-high-definition monitor mounted on the living room wall and pressed the play button. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the dim room with a harsh blue glow. The audio kicked in, instantly loud and distorted. It was footage from a security camera inside a high-stakes lounge in a casino. I had obtained it through a private investigator who had tracked Connor's movements during his bachelor weekend. The date stamp in the corner was from 3 days ago. On the screen, Connor was sitting at a blackjack table. He was drunk. His tie was undone, and his arm was draped possessively around a woman who was definitely not my sister. She was wearing a cocktail dress that left little to the imagination, and she was laughing at something he had just whispered. Connor took a swig of beer and turned to the woman, his voice booming over the speakers in my penthouse. "Do not worry about the wedding, babe," he slurred. "It is just a show. The girl is a moron. She thinks I am her Prince Charming, but she is just the key to the vault. Once I get that land transfer on Friday night, I am cashing out. I give it 2 weeks before I file for an annulment. I will be on a beach in the Cayman Islands, and she will be back in the classroom crying over her yearbooks." The woman on the screen giggled and asked about the parents. Connor threw his head back and laughed, a sound that was cruel and dismissive. "The old man and the old lady," he scoffed. "They are part of the baggage. But I have a plan for them too. Once the money hits my account, I am putting them in the cheapest state-run nursing home I can find. Let them rot in a facility that smells like bleach and regret. I am not spending a dime of my fortune on those 2 losers." The video cut to black. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb that had just detonated, but the dust had not yet settled. I looked at my mother. Clara was staring at the blank screen, her mouth open in a silent scream. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and waxen. Her knees gave way and she collapsed onto the Persian rug, not with a dramatic faint, but with the heavy thud of a body that has lost the will to stand. She did not cry. She just gasped for air, clutching her chest, as if her heart had physically broken. My father Otis looked like he had been punched in the gut. He was gripping the arm of the sofa, his knuckles white. He stared at Connor with a look of betrayal so profound it was painful to witness. This was the man he had trusted. This was the man he had risked his freedom for. And this man had just called him a loser and planned to discard him like trash. Connor sat frozen at the dining table. He looked from the screen to me and then to my parents. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He tried to form a denial, but the evidence was undeniable. The charming mask had not just slipped. I had ripped it off and set it on fire. Connor scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over backward. He tried to sputter a defense, claiming the video was a deepfake generated by AI, but the sweat pouring down his forehead told a different story. I did not give him time to formulate a lie. I reached out and picked up the geological survey he had so carelessly tossed aside earlier. I held it up like a weapon. "You were in such a rush to close the deal, Connor, that you forgot the first rule of acquisition. Always read the prospectus." I tossed the report onto the table where it landed with a heavy thud right on top of his signed confession. "Look at the red line, Connor," I said, my voice cutting through his panic. "You thought you were stealing a cattle ranch. You thought you were stealing 500 acres of dust and dry scrub. You were actually stealing one of the largest unmined lithium deposits in the continental United States. My grandfather called it the burning stone. The rest of the world calls it spodumene. It is the fuel source for the next century." Connor stared at the paper, his eyes bulging. He knew exactly what lithium was worth. I walked around the table, closing the distance between us. I did the math for you earlier. Based on current market rates, the extraction royalties for Legacy Hills are valued at $150 million. You knew this. That is why you were so desperate. You were trying to buy a diamond mine for the price of a gumball. You were going to defraud my father of a generational fortune to cover your own pathetic gambling debts. He looked at the deed he had just signed and then back at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure greed. It does not matter, he snarled, reaching for the papers. I signed the deed. The land is mine. The transfer is legal. I will sell it tonight before you can do anything about it. I laughed, a cold, hard sound that made him freeze. You really do not understand who you are dealing with, do you? I am not just a sister protecting her family. I am a forensic accountant who knows how the system works. You cannot sell that land tonight. You cannot sell it ever. At 8 o'clock this morning, I filed a formal disclosure with the Texas Bureau of Land Management and the United States Department of Energy. I declared the property a site of strategic national interest pending a federal environmental impact study. Connor went pale. He understood what that meant. A federal hold freezes the title instantly. No bank would touch it. No title company would insure it. And most importantly, the money laundering syndicate he had sold it to would not be able to take possession. I leaned in close enough to smell the scotch on his breath. The asset is frozen, Connor. You cannot deliver the title to your friends. You took their $2 million deposit and spent it, and now you have nothing to give them in return. The land is safe, but you are very much not. I lifted the black binder from the table. It felt heavy in my hands, not because of the paper weight, but because of the justice contained inside. Connor was still reeling from the news about the freeze on the assets, but he was looking at the binder like it was his last life raft. He extended a trembling hand, expecting me to hand over the deed he believed he had just executed. He thought that even if the land was frozen, he still held the legal title. He thought he could still negotiate with the syndicate if he could prove ownership. He was wrong. I took a step back, holding the binder out of his reach. I flipped the document open to the first page he had signed. I peeled back the neon yellow sticky note that I had strategically placed to obscure the header text. I turned the page around so he could see exactly what he had put his name to. It was not a warranty deed. It was not a transfer of assets. It was a standard Department of Justice form, used for plea bargains. I began to read aloud, my voice ringing with clarity in the silent room. I, Kyle Connor, also known as Connor Davis, hereby admit to the willful fabrication of financial instruments for the purpose of defrauding Otis and Clara Williams. I further admit to impersonating a federal tax officer and forging government documents regarding property tax liens. By signing below, I waive my right to counsel and submit this sworn affidavit as a voluntary confession to violations of Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1343 regarding wire fraud and Section 1028 regarding identity theft. Connor froze. His eyes scanned the document, desperately looking for the property description or the transfer clauses. They were not there. I had switched the interior pages of the binder while he was distracted by his own arrogance. He had been so eager to see the X and sign his name that he had not bothered to read a single word of the text. He had just signed a full and comprehensive confession to every crime he had committed against my family. He had handed the prosecutor a conviction on a silver platter. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The blood rushed to his face, turning it a deep, violent shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged as the magnitude of his mistake crashed down on him. He had not just lost the money, he had just sentenced himself to 20 years in federal prison. The smug sophistication vanished entirely. What remained was the raw, animalistic aggression of a cornered beast. He let out a guttural roar of rage. "You bitch!" he screamed, spitting the words. He lunged across the dining table, ignoring the crystal glasses and the water pitcher which shattered onto the floor. He was not trying to negotiate anymore. He was trying to destroy the evidence. He scrambled over the mahogany surface, his hands clawing for the binder. He was fast and he was desperate, but he had forgotten that I never enter a war room without reinforcements. As his fingers brushed the edge of the leather binder, the kitchen door swung open, and the trap finally snapped shut. The impact was visceral. Before Connor's fingers could even graze the leather binder, Officer Miller hit him from the blind side with the force of a linebacker. The collision sent Connor flying off the mahogany table and crashing onto the marble floor with a bone-jarring thud. He did not have time to scream. Within seconds, 3 other officers were on top of him, pinning his limbs and pressing his face against the cold stone. The expensive charcoal suit tore at the shoulder, and his gold watch smashed against the floor tiles. The sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed through the room, like the final gavel strike of a judge. David stepped out from the kitchen holding his badge high. "Kyle Connor, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion," he announced, his voice calm and authoritative. "You have the right to remain silent." Connor thrashed underneath the weight of the officers, spitting blood from a bitten lip. He was feral, kicking and cursing, trying to twist his way out of the hold. He was still fighting because he thought the worst thing that could happen to him was prison. He was wrong. Suddenly a sound cut through the chaos. It was a shrill, jarring ringtone coming from inside Connor's jacket pocket. Connor froze instantly. His body went rigid and the color drained from his face, leaving him gray and deathly pale. The struggle evaporated. He knew that ringtone. It was the dedicated line for the encrypted phone. It was the broker. It was 8 o'clock and the deadline had passed. They were calling to confirm the transfer or to initiate the liquidation protocol. One of the officers reached into the pocket and pulled out the vibrating device. He held it up. The screen glowed red with the words, "Unknown caller." Connor stared at the phone as if it were a live grenade. He looked at the window, terrified that a sniper scope was already trained on his head. He realized in that split second that outside of this penthouse, he was a dead man. The syndicate did not accept excuses, and they did not accept refunds on spent money. His demeanor shifted violently. Panic replaced rage. "Take me in!" he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "Get me out of here right now! You have to take me into custody!" He began to squirm against the floor, not to escape the police, but to burrow deeper into their protection. "Do not answer that phone. Just arrest me. I am guilty. I signed the paper. Please just put me in the car." He was begging for a jail cell. He was pleading for federal prison because he knew it was the only fortress in the world thick enough to stop a cartel hit squad. I looked down at him, weeping and shivering on my floor. The man who had walked in here like a king was now begging to be a prisoner. Justice was not just served, it was absolute. He had tried to trap us, but he had only succeeded in locking himself in a cage for his own survival. Officer Miller hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the door, while Connor continued to sob, grateful for the handcuffs that were now the only thing keeping him alive. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of Connor's pathetic whimpering and leaving a deafening silence in his wake. The chaotic energy of the arrest dissipated, leaving only the wreckage of a family that had been shattered and glued back together in the span of an hour. My father Otis collapsed onto the sofa. He looked small. The imposing patriarch who had commanded the church steps only yesterday was gone, replaced by an old man crushed by the weight of his own gullibility. He buried his face in his tremulous hands and wept. It was not a cry of relief. It was the deep, guttural sobbing of a man who realized his vanity had almost cost him his children. Mom was the first to speak. She walked toward me, her hands reaching out tentatively as if she were afraid I might bite her. "Kanisha," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry. We were so blind. We just wanted the best for Layla. We thought he was the answer to our prayers. We treated you so terribly. Please forgive us." Layla did not speak. She simply moved. She crossed the room in a blur and collided with me, throwing her arms around my neck with enough force to nearly knock me over. She buried her face in my shoulder and shook violently, releasing months of suppressed terror. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight, feeling the sharp angles of her ribs. She was safe. That was the only victory that truly mattered to me in that moment. I stroked her hair and let her cry, knowing that she was finally mourning the death of the illusion. But when my parents moved to join the embrace, I stepped back. I gently disentangled myself from Layla and stood straight, smoothing the front of my blazer. I looked at Otis and Clara not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a CEO addressing a board of directors that had failed due to gross negligence. The time for sentimentality was over. This was the time for restructuring. "Stop," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was hard enough to freeze them in their tracks. "I do not want your tears. And I do not want your apologies. Apologies do not fix bankruptcy, and they do not protect assets from predators." I walked over to the mahogany table and picked up the geological report, holding it like a gavel. "I love you because you are my parents. I forgive you for the insults and for the doubt, because I know you were manipulated by a professional. But we need to be crystal clear about how this family operates from this moment forward." I looked my father dead in the eye. "You have proven tonight that you are incapable of managing this level of wealth. You let a wolf into the henhouse because he flattered your ego. You almost signed away a $150 million fortune for a fake debt." Otis flinched, but he did not look away. He knew it was the truth. "I am taking over," I stated flatly. "I will establish the trust. I will hire the legal team. I will negotiate the extraction contracts with the mining companies. You will receive a generous monthly stipend, and you will live in comfort for the rest of your lives. But the days of you making financial decisions for this family are over. You have lost your veto power. I am the trustee, and my word is final." The room was silent. My mother looked at my father, waiting for him to explode to assert his dominance as the head of the household. But Otis just looked at me. He saw the steel in my spine. He saw the competence that he had ignored for years. He nodded slowly, a gesture of absolute surrender. "You are right, Kenesha," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You are the only one who can save us. It is yours." The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers had long since faded into the steady red and white stream of Atlanta traffic below. The apartment was quiet now. The lawyers had packed up their briefcases, the officers had filed their reports, and my family had retreated to the guest suites, exhausted by the emotional whiplash of the evening. I stood alone on the balcony, letting the cool night wind dry the perspiration on my neck. I held the glass of scotch that Connor had poured for himself, but never tasted. It was a single malt aged for a quarter of a century, which was fitting. It took time to mature something valuable, and it took only a second for a fool to spill it. I looked out at the skyline, a sprawling grid of electricity and ambition. People often ask me why I chose forensic accounting. They think it is boring. They think it is just spreadsheets and tax codes. They do not understand that money is the blood of the world, and if you track the blood, you find the wound. Tonight, I had not just closed a case. I had cauterized a wound that had been threatening to bleed my family dry for generations. My grandfather Silas bought that land in West Texas when he was not even allowed to eat in the diner in town. He paid for it with sweat and humiliation and a stubborn refusal to be moved. He did not know about the lithium. He did not know about the electric vehicle revolution. But he knew something far more important. He knew that for a Black family in America, land is not just an asset. It is sovereignty. It is the one thing they cannot fire you from. It is the one thing that says we are here and we are not leaving. Connor was not unique. He was just the latest face in a long line of predators who have tried to strip us of that sovereignty. He looked at my father and saw a gullible old man. He looked at my sister and saw a desperate girl. He looked at me and saw a bitter spinster. He made the fatal mistake of confusing kindness with weakness. He did not realize that the reason I am cold is because I am the shield. He did not realize that while my family was praying for a miracle, I was busy engineering one. They call it generational wealth. It is a buzzword people throw around at seminars. But tonight, I realize the true cost of it. It is not just about compounding interest or diversified portfolios. It is about vigilance. It is about being the one person in the room willing to be called the villain to ensure there is still a roof over everyone's head in the morning. I accepted that role tonight. I took the power not because I wanted to rule, but because I was the only one strong enough to hold the keys without handing them over to the first wolf who knocked on the door. I raised the crystal glass to the city lights, to the invisible spirit of Granddaddy Silas, and to the future that was now undeniably ours. To the burning stone, I whispered. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warmth of the victory settle in my chest. Then I turned. I looked directly into the lens of the hidden camera that was still recording, a subtle acknowledgement that I see everything now. I smiled. It was not the smile of a sister or a daughter. It was the smile of a queen who had just secured her borders. The screen went black. The most profound lesson from Kanisha's victory is that protecting a legacy requires more than just ownership. It demands unyielding vigilance. Predators do not just attack our bank accounts, they exploit our deepest emotional vulnerabilities, our pride, our loneliness, and our fears. Blind trust is a luxury we cannot afford when the stakes are generational. True power lies in knowing the real value of what you possess and having the courage to ask the hard questions even when it is unpopular. Knowledge is not just power, it is the only shield against those who wish to steal your future. If you enjoyed watching intelligence triumph over greed, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help others protect their legacy.